Local productions seen on Delta College Public Media are made possible with support from viewers like you. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Mike Redford, and this is the follow-up. Coming up on tonight's show, a controversial Michigan Supreme Court decision has opened the door for major increases in the minimum wage and changes on paid leave for Michigan workers. While that may sound good, some analysts claim many businesses simply cannot afford it and may be forced to close their doors. We have two guests tonight, one from the Michigan Chamber of Commerce and the other a mid-Michigan man who knows a thing or two about our business climate. But first, we would like to hear from you to help drive the conversation here on the show. You can do that in a variety of ways via social media on Facebook. You can email us, and you can dial into our follow-up hotline to voice your opinion or suggest future show topics. And if you'd like to watch any of our past shows, you can log on to deltapublicmedia.org. Our guest tonight, Wendy Black. She's a Senior Vice President of Business Advocacy with the Michigan Chamber of Commerce. She joins us live virtually, as you can see. Jimmy Green in studio with me, officially Special Events Sales Director of the Saginaw Spirit, but everyone knows Jimmy has a wealth of business experience, founder of the Jimmy Green and Associates consulting firm and former longtime president, CEO of the Builders and Contractors of Michigan. You could be useful to this conversation.
Maybe a little bit.
So let me take a stab at this, Wendy and Jimmy. The Michigan Supreme Court made a monumental decision impacting paid leave minimum wage back in late July. In essence, they ruled the state lawmakers back in 2018, it was largely Republicans at the time, pulled a bait and switch of sorts. I know you don't like that term, but leveraging what's called adopt and amend, which prevented two statewide ballot issues from being voted on, and that would have dramatically increased the minimum wage and created more liberal paid leave policies. The High Court's ruling result, those policies will take effect in February, late February, dramatically impacting Michigan business owners. So, Wendy, have at it. What do you make of that?
Yeah, so we're extremely disappointed by the Supreme Court's decision. Frankly, there's been a lot of back and forth between the courts on this issue about whether the legislature had the right to take two ballot proposals that got sufficient signatures to qualify for the ballot and to adopt and subsequently amend in the same legislative session. Now, the Constitution talks clearly about the role of the legislature and the role the legislature plays when issues qualify for the ballot, when they get enough signatures to get on the ballot. But the question the Supreme Court came back on was whether they had that right to adopt and amend in the same legislative session. So we're obviously very concerned about this decision. We believe that the impact will be felt by job providers and workers alike. That this sounds great in theory until you start digging in on the details and you realize that it actually could end up hurting the very workers it's intended to help.
Well, you've heard your opponents, your critics of this. Some will say, majority of Michiganders probably would have supported those two ballot issues in 2018 had it made it to the ballot. And I guess those critics, those opponents would say lawmakers may have, through that adopt and amend, just circumvented what would have been the will of the people. So what do you say to that?
Yeah, so we fundamentally disagree with that. And I don't think that the court really said that what the legislature did here isn't allowed. It's just a question of when the legislature had the right to amend. So they adopted and amended in the same legislative session. And now the court has come back and said, no, you have to wait until that subsequent legislative session to amend. So we'll see here coming up, if the legislature agrees with Michigan job providers that the details here, the implementation questions here really are complicated and complex, very nuanced, and whether subsequent changes or subsequent amendments to those two statutes are appropriate. And we hope that they will.
I'm going to Jimmy here in a moment, but I want you to walk through sort of the we need to know. Let's start with paid leave. Gives workers a lot more leverage when taking time off. I know we have a graphic here that we're going to show our viewers, which I know you're familiar with these slides. So kind of go through that. No exemptions and accrual and rethinking PTO. There's a lot here. So just kind of walk us through that a little bit.
Sure. So the court ordered into effect something called the Earned Sick Time Act, or ESTA, and it puts into place a sweeping new mandate that impacts every employer in the state of Michigan. Anyone who has one or more employees must comply with this new earned sick time mandate. It applies to full time, to part time, to seasonal employees, to temporary employees, and potentially even to independent contractors based on how broadly the definition of employee is drafted. So it requires employers to provide 1 hour of earned sick time to employees for every 30 hours worked. 72 hours in a year can be used. An employee actually could accrue more than that if they work enough. And those that have fewer than 10 employees, so anyone with 9 or less employees, have to pay out that time 40 hours paid, 32 hours unpaid. That's the only reprieve for small businesses. Now, where this starts to get complicated and messy is in the finer point details. The act really tries to micromanage how employers handle their paid time off policies. And there's a lot of employers that have moved to combining their paid time off policies and putting everything into one big paid time off, or PTO, bank, right? Where it's a time off bank that can be used for vacation time, for personal time, and for sick time. And this act, when it goes into effect in February, is going to force employers to rethink whether that continues to make sense for their workplace. So this is where it starts to kind of get ugly in terms of impacting employees in a way that they very well may not like. And it's because employers are kind of being backed into a corner on this and thinking about separating out their time, or being forced to separate out their time, because the act says that employees only have to give notice of the need for leave as soon as practicable. It's undefined. Basically, the employee just kind of has to let you know loosey goosey whenever that they're not going to make it. The time off can be used in the smallest of increments that employers use to track payroll. For some employers, they may track payroll in 1 minute increments. Some may track in 6 minute increments. Some in maybe 15-minute or half an hour increments, and that's kind of if they're lucky. And so if you have this one PTO bank, maybe it's 4 weeks of vacation that you give to your employees, or 4 weeks of PTO, you would have to allow them then to use that time in those small increments. It limits documentation. So if an employee is out for 3 consecutive days, you can require them to get a doctor's note, but the employer has to pay for all costs associated with that. And the icing on the cake here, the real concern is just that this act creates all sorts of new avenues to litigation. It doesn't just require an employee who believes that they've been aggrieved to go to a state agency to file a complaint. It allows them to go straight and find themselves a plaintiff's attorney and to file a lawsuit in court. And it creates sweeping new presumptions, basically assuming that employers are retaliating against employees for exercising their right to earn sick time, and puts the burden of proof more firmly in the employer's responsibility. So this whole thing is just very detailed, very complicated. I don't think anyone disagrees with the idea of giving sick time to employees. Nobody wants sick employees at work, but it's really about the implementation, and we want to make sure that implementation works and that employers aren't forced to make wholesale changes, and basically changes that employees are not going to want. And that they themselves don't want to make either, but this act is going to require them to.
We'll
do.
hit the need to know minimum wage in a moment. Jim, I'm bringing you in. You've
Sure.
been around the block from a business standpoint. When you looked at sort of the impact of sort of paid leave, what stuck out to you? How do you see it?
Lots of it. I made some notes on here too. And you know what really strikes me, and the sadness about this is that it seems and it comes across as a political maneuver. And it may very well be, but the truth of the matter is this is an economic issue. It really is, has been, always will be, whether you're Democrat, Republican, Independent. I think about our community in particular. Look at Dow Chemical. They're huge enough to be able to make these kind of modifications in a heartbeat. But stop where Dow shops, the florist, the clothing shop, the candy store. When I go down Main Street in Midland, there isn't one of those stores, and I'm very intimately know these business owners. There's not one of them that could actually do this. I mean, who would do this? They couldn't possibly do it, not to mention the climate that you set as a business environment. And we talk about those people who are already here. Now imagine you're in Indiana, Illinois,
Mm-hmm.
Ohio, and now you're thinking about opening up a business here. Under these circumstances, I don't think you could. So we're talking economics, we're talking commerce, we're talking entrepreneurialism, we're talking a whole lot of different things. But unfortunately, because we're in this climate of political acrimony, that's what it seems like. And I always, and I want your listeners, in particular your viewers, to pay attention to that. Discount the politics in this and ask them when they walk into the 7-Eleven, the coffee shop, any place they walk into, ask, can they possibly expect the business owner this documentation, litigation, fines, the margins. The margins for small business owners is so minute. Hiring somebody to document this would practically put them out of business before they put the open sign up. So I think that's one of the things I wanted to convey, because Wendy talks way up here, and rightfully so, because she's talking with legislators about the political impact of this. But when you hit Main Street Midland, when you hit Main Street in Frankenmuth or in Saginaw and Old Town, it's a whole different kind of argument. And I'm telling you what, these are Democrat and Republican business owners who simply can't afford to stay in business under this kind of mandate.
Yeah.
And it is a mandate.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You want to expand on what Jimmy said, Wendy?
Well, I think what I would say is make no mistake about it. Regardless of whether you're offering a very generous pay time off policy to your employees today, like if you're a business that's doing that, you are going to still need to make changes. And we just don't think that that makes a lot of sense. If you have a pay time off policy today that meets or exceeds that 72-hour threshold, we just don't think it makes any sense to make disruptive changes and to make changes that employees very well may not like. So, I mean, that's kind of our number one ask with the legislature is to say, if you're already a model employer in this regard, why do we want to force you to make changes? And I think that resonates with a lot of people, like especially some of businesses that have very great policies today, and they're saying to us, we have to make so many changes. There are no quick fixes to getting in compliance with this act, and that's really troublesome.
And I think one of the things she hit on too earlier too was the number. So you're talking 2 employees versus 200 employees.
Right.
The idea that there's no distinction, that's ludicrous. I mean, seriously, if you don't do anything else, you certainly have to look at a carve out, because the differences in documentation and some of the things required in this mandate between a 4-person operation versus a 400-person operation is like Jupiter and Mars.
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So let's move from paid leave. Let's do the need to know on the minimum wage. So let's throw that up for the viewers. And Wendy, why don't you talk over that? There are the numbers, effective February 21st of next year, unless the legislature steps in, is able to halt this or change this. And the other thing, I guess, is that under the ruling, it will make up for increases in the minimum wage that would have scaled up over 6 years had it been implemented in, I guess, 2019, when the lawmakers, in essence, halted the 2 ballot issues. So, Wendy, you want to take that?
Yeah, so this is the new increase in the minimum wage that will go into effect in 2025. And so you see here the minimum wage will increase from, it's actually $10.56 an hour, because we found out from the state last week that there will be an increase in the minimum wage on January 1. But on February 21, the minimum wage will increase to $12.48. And then again in February of 2026, it will increase again till we get to 2028, where the minimum wage will be $14.97. And then beginning in 2029, it will go on autopilot. We'll have these annual increases based on the rate of inflation using this urban CPI measurement. And so, this is not maybe as big of a concern as it might otherwise be, just because of where market wages are, right? In a lot of regions across our state, the going rate, the entry wage is in that $12.50, $13, up to $15 or more an hour. And so where the big concern on this really becomes, or it comes in, is with the hospitality industry, because what this now would do is it will fully eliminate what's known as the tipped minimum wage. So today, all tipped employees are guaranteed to make the full minimum wage, but how they get there is a little bit different than a non-tipped employee. So the tipped employee gets a minimum wage rate of 38% of the full minimum wage. And when their tips are added on top of that, if they don't make the full minimum wage, the employer has to pay the difference. What the Supreme Court ruling says and does is it says no more. We are not going to have a tip minimum wage. We are going to require those establishments to pay 100% of the full minimum wage with all tips on top. Okay, so this is a 288% increase in labor costs for the hospitality industry. So if your restaurant, or if your viewers have been wondering why the restaurant and bar industries have been freaking out about this Supreme Court decision, it's because of this provision. There's just no good way to come up with the money to pay for a 288% increase in your labor costs and essentially do it over a very short time frame. The Michigan Restaurant and Lodging Association has done a number of surveys of restaurant operators across Michigan. We believe anywhere from 40 to 60,000 jobs will be lost in Michigan as a result of this. That menu prices will have to increase on average 25%. Many restaurants just don't think that the math works. The math isn't mathing, and will be forced to close. And so tipped employees too are just outraged on this. A few weeks ago, you had a protest at the state capitol where you had over, I believe, 600, maybe even 700 tipped workers storm the capitol and say, save our tips. We like the system as it is, hands off our tips. Let's retain the tip minimum wage. And so this is of huge concern and really is, it's going to put us in this outlier status similar to the Earned Sick Time Act, frankly. In this case, Illinois is the only other state that has even close to a minimum wage rate like where Michigan is going, and just a real concern across the board.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm glad you brought up that protest because it was largely bartenders and service. They didn't ask for this, okay? It's going to hurt their bottom line. Yeah. In my circle of influence of people I've been talking to about this, many of them are bartenders and servers. They'll say, hey, listen, if this goes in, customers aren't going to tip, or they're maybe not tip at all. So I get where that's coming from, right? That's going to happen.
Yeah.
There's that trickle down there, right?
Well, tip on what?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
Sorry.
Wendy.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, we've seen in other municipalities and other regions where this happened that tipping habits do change. There's already tipping fatigue, right? Like when you go to the coffee shop, or
Right.
when I went to the car wash and somebody asked for a tip, and I think people are just like, wait, are you a tipped employee and are you making the tip minimum wage, or are you making the full minimum wage and just expecting tips on top? And so, when people believe that someone's making the full minimum wage and they're being paid, at that full minimum wage, they're less inclined to give that 18, 20+% tip on top. Maybe I'll throw you $1 or $2, like if you're especially friendly or helpful, but I'm certainly not going to tip at the same levels that I would if I know that that's kind of part of your wages, right? You're hustling so you can take home a good hourly wage based on the type of job that you have.
And that was kind of my point about tipping on top of what. I mean, right. Don't forget, one key element in this is staying in business, right?
Right.
So if you're incurring this increased cost, that's a pass-through. The pass-through is to you. So where traditionally you might tip on a $12 meal, now you're tipping on a $22 meal. Right. If you start adding in that increase, if you go, that's another element right there. You may not even be able to afford to go to the restaurant you typically visit, especially with a family of 4 or 5. Think about that increased cost. I don't think tipping is the issue here. It's being in business, staying in business for a lot of these restaurants. That's really critical. Again, I'm going to keep talking about the economic piece of this because we're talking about sustainability of a business with small margins to begin with. Now, this on top of the documentation piece, when you start talking about the paid leave piece, I don't know how you could feasibly think about opening up a business in this state under those conditions. I don't care what your politics are. Economically, it's almost impossible. And then the idea that may vary based on who's in office. We're creating a climate here that makes it impossible for an entrepreneur to really seriously think about doing business here and making a modest living when you don't know who you can hire, at what rate, And if you're thinking even a restaurant or hospitality, as Wendy mentioned earlier, I mean, you're in dire straits.
Right.
So I just think we really need to settle down and really think about the economic impact here on families. We need to think about the sustainability of businesses. They just can't incur this kind of mandate and this kind of cost structure. It's just impossible to do.
I'm glad you brought that up because I had the pleasure of catching a presentation Wendy did last week here in mid-Michigan, and she mentioned Hopcat as a good example that they're trying to grow in Michigan. They've got a pretty good brand.
Right.
So talk to us about that, Wendy. They're kind of like putting a halt to any expansion, right?
Yeah, I think this is a good example where companies are saying, we're not going to invest in Michigan. We're going to invest in Ohio and in other states. And we've heard this countless times. I've been out on the road for the last few months and talking to at local chamber meetings and other forums, just kind of getting the word out about what the Supreme Court decision means for businesses and how the legislature can still work to make this better, right? And talking about the need of the business community to engage. But you hear time and time again that I had plans to expand. I had plans to maybe open a second or a third location. And all of those plans are now on ice because I don't know that I can make the math work here. And I don't know that I want to continue to put my life savings on the line to open a business without knowing whether I can pay for all these things and whether it's actually going to work at the end of the day, right? Because people are worried about loans getting called. If they can't bring in the revenue that they need and the profits don't work, the profit line it doesn't work, then like they're done, right? It's really sad.
So go ahead.
No, I was going to say Wendy represents over 5,000 business
Right.
owners here in the state of Michigan. And I suggested even before we came on the air that this is truly an opportunity for some bipartisanship. And what I mean by that is carve outs. You can't treat that business like that business and expect to have a business climate that's friendly to businesses here. The minimum wage piece of it, I think the tip wage is hugely problematic, but minimum wage, we're a competitive state. I mean, the fact that it's $12.38, you can make $15 at McDonald's or $15 practically anywhere. That's a competitive environment. I've got no problem with that. But I think the idea that one is like the other is hugely the problem. And now there's this huge envelope over everything as if everything is the same, and it truly is not. So I'm hoping that through Wendy's advocacy, that she's at least able to talk to these legislators about looking at some modifications of this. Is it going to go away? Probably not. But there's certainly an opportunity for some modification that business owners can look at this state and say, I'm going to stay here, or more importantly, business owners outside of here can say, I'll move there.
Wendy, by trade, you're a lobbyist, right? So
Yeah,
you've got a short amount of time now between now and the end of the year to go to the legislature and say, listen, guys and gals, this is not going to be good. We've got to come up with a compromise, bipartisan plan, as Jimmy said, in a presidential election here that's kind of been out there. So tell me what's happening in the back rooms with advocacy. Do you have any hope of bringing the two sides together and say, hey, we got to do something different? And think about this. In 2018, it was a Republican-controlled legislature. Now it's Democratic-controlled. They might not move on this at all, right?
Yeah. So, frankly, like the timeline here is very short. So it's an election year. Legislators are not in Lansing for the most part voting. They're at home in their districts, rounding up votes for reelection, right? So we have probably only 13 session days between now and the end of the year. That's not a lot of days to get something done, or certainly to get something controversial done. And we're also moving into this lame duck period, this period of time between after the November elections before the end of the year, and this kind of crazy season in Lansing. But we've spent the last, since the Supreme Court decision came out, that amount of time talking to legislators on both sides of the aisle, talking about how we want to make sure that implementation works for employers and businesses alike. So on the minimum wage piece is talking about retaining the tip minimum wage, retaining some piece of that and making sure that that works. And then on the earned sick time piece, we have kind of a number of things that we would like to see change, starting with the fact that if you meet or exceed that 72 hours today, that you shouldn't have to make significant changes to your pay time off policies. We'd like to see some exemptions for small businesses and part-time employees and seasonal employees, and to clarify that independent contractor piece. We want to get rid of the private right of action. We believe that responsibility to enforce this should rest with the state, and that we shouldn't be just rushing to file lawsuits, right? And we want to make sure that employers can front load all 72 hours at the start of the year and avoid some of these complex carryover requirements that are in the law as written. So I think those conversations have been productive, especially when we help lawmakers understand that we're not looking to gut what the Supreme Court did, or we recognize it's probably not feasible to go back to status quo, but we want to make sure that implementation works. But we have some opponents on this, and they're working hard too, and they think, well, the Supreme Court spoke on this, we won, the legislature shouldn't do anything. And so it's really just going to be a strong battle to the end. And we're hopeful, though, that when people learn about what we're asking and they see that it's reasonable in nature, that Republicans and Democrats, people from both sides of the aisle, can come together and pass common sense legislation and a common sense solution.
Right. Mm-hmm. We got about a minute or so left. So what can constituents do? What can we do as residents? What can our viewers do? I mean, I'm going to put up your website label there. They can look at that to get more information. What else? How would you encourage them to get involved, no matter what side they're on this? I mean.
So we're strong believers in the power of the constituent, right? Lawmakers work for their constituents. They're the reasons they have a job, right? And so if you've heard something tonight that resonates with you, you're concerned about this, that maybe that sounds good, but the details are really concerning, we would just encourage you to make your voice heard with your legislator. You would be surprised at how few constituents actually reach out to their legislators. And so when they do, that is very powerful, especially powerful when someone like me talks to a legislator in Lansing and then they are back home at a meeting or at the grocery store or wherever, and they hear the same thing.
True. Well, Wendy Block, thank you so much. Good luck with your efforts to see if we can amend this again between now and the end there. And Jimmy, of course.
Thanks, Wendy.
Appreciate your feedback, and thanks for joining us in the follow-up tonight.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And that's our show for tonight, but be sure to join us again next Tuesday night right here for the follow-up. It's been a year since the horrible Hamas attack on Israel, escalating the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. It's impacting many families right here at home. That is the focus of our show next week here on the follow-up. Thanks for joining us. Have a great night, everyone.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And make sure to click that bell icon to stay notified when we upload new content. Videos like this are only possible because of viewers like you. To help support this channel, click on the link in the description below. We'll see you next time.